Hello, I'm Courtney Chambers, your webinar host from the ERNIC Environmental Laboratory. I'm glad you could join us for this webinar sponsored by the Ecosystem Management and Restoration Research Program. Today we have an opportunity to learn about the development of the Coastal Vulnerability Assessment Framework and tool to expedite identification, screening, and prioritization of candidate restoration sites. Okay, at this time I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Mr. Bobby McComas is a research chemical engineer with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center's Environmental Laboratory in Vicksburg, Mississippi. He has 9 years of experience in research of contaminated sediment remediation and ecosystem restoration. Mr. McComas works for the Dredge Material Management Team under Dr. Paul Schroeder and the Ecosystem Restoration Team under Dr. Craig Fishnick. Mr. McComas has worked in the coastal arena for 7 years and has partnered with districts on multiple projects to restore coastal functions and improve coastal resilience. And as I said earlier, more information about Bobby can be found in his bio posted on the Environment Gateway's webinar page, which is the link I've referenced on our welcome slide today, and I can also share that with you at the end of the meeting today. Bobby, we are excited to learn from you today about the Coastal Vulnerability Assessment Framework. At this time, I'm going to give you the presenter right, and we can get started.
Thank you, Courtney. First of all, I'd like to thank Courtney for being such a gracious host and helping to set up and put on this webinar. And please, I would like this to be as interactive as possible, so please do think about questions if you want to hold them until the very end, or if you want to send me an email after this discussion, please do. And I'd like to get as much input from the field and everybody on the call, or anybody from the teams included in this list. Please do follow up with me after the call. First of all, let's start with an overview of the talk. I'm gonna define and describe some of the vulnerability and related concepts. We're going to discuss some of the literature regarding key lessons from vulnerability assessments. We're going to discuss the habitat types that we are interested in researching, and that's where I'd also like a lot of input. So if I have left out a habitat type that is of key interest to your district or to your team, please do help us, and we'll add that to it and include that in the framework. We're going to talk about some of the different vulnerability and impact assessment approaches, and then describe some of the various framework assessments, vulnerability assessments. A couple of the core primary missions is to restore significant ecosystem function, structure, and dynamic processes that have been degraded. We're going to develop a comprehensive examination of problems contributing to the significant degradation and develop alternative means for their solution. One of the scopes of this project is to prevent future degradation in nationally and regionally significant wetlands and riparian aquatic systems, or wetlands and coastal features, and look at things on a broad watershed or regional water resources management context. And some of the research drivers for this particular work unit are a statement of need sent into the Ecosystem Management and Restoration Research Program, EMRRP, the OMB critique. The Environmental Advisory Board had several recommendations to look into this topic as well. Just to give you a little background about this project, it was a proposed new work unit in 2006, and we are finishing up the second year of this research project. And currently we've got a publication in the tracking system to get out that looks at a review of current vulnerability assessments, and we're also working on a framework and a tool to provide by the end of the FY. The purpose and objective of this work unit, our goal is to develop a rapid tool to assess and relatively rank coastal systems to their vulnerability and environmental stressors. And currently we're working on incorporating the important coastal habitat types and the ability to rapidly and apply a coastal to all coastal areas of North America. Want to be able to assess these systems in relatively short order and on a consistent basis across the Corps of Engineers. First of all, you might ask yourself, what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is defined as a system's ability to cope with adverse effects of stress or hazards, and the system's ability to cope is further defined as absorbing the action of an environmental stressor without shifting to an alternative state or habitat, such as the mudflat changing to open water. Adverse effects are defined as anything negative, a net negative impact to the system, and such as the wind waves removing the vegetation layer of a habitat. But why do we measure coastal vulnerability? Coastal habitats provide vital environmental, economic, and cultural services for a large percentage of the North American population. Coastal habitats provide critical support for terrestrial and marine plant and wildlife as they support important economic activities. Additionally, coastal habitats provide protection for human-built infrastructure from storm damages, and the mission of the U.S. Army includes reducing risk of damage related to storm and the restoration of aquatic natural habitats. First, we're going to discuss the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, from here on, their approach to vulnerability. According to van der Leeuw, vulnerability first came to be used in an adverse sense as an inherent quality of non-human species and dynamics subject to anthropogenic impact. Then, from a coevolutionary point of view, it was defined as a property of certain relationships between species or individuals. Now it is seen as a potential system state. It's becoming clear that persons, groups, and systems usually respond not to one, but rather to multiple stressors operating at different scales in space and through time. The same is with biomass. The example is the farmers in Mexico are usually confronted to variability and change, open markets, retrenchment of the state, deterioration of the land and water, among other stressors. Same as with the biomass carbon in forest. This pool is vulnerable to land use changes, fire, changes in water cycle, as well as to teleconnected processes and demand for wood, national policies, and multiple stressors. In terms of temporal scales, the extent of past adaptation influences the current coping mechanism, which determine whether a system is able to undertake adaptation actions to reduce vulnerability. Although adaptation is determined not only by the system and its history, but also the behavior of its stressors. Some of the key research issues is understanding its social and natural, causal and internal dimensions and across multiple disciplines. The IPCC's approach to adaptive capacity. Economic, socio-political, infrastructural, ecological, and personal assets. The important issue here is that that assets people control contribute to mitigate their vulnerability and strengthen their resilience toward economic and ecological risks. Social assets are more relevant for vulnerable populations controlling few economic, socio-political, infrastructural, and ecological personal assets. But the adaptive is the ability of a system or group to evolve or accommodate to climate change or expand the range of variability with which it can cope. Unevenly distributed related to assets available to cope with climate change, distribution of resources within a population, and institutions mediating exposures and coping with the climate change. Next, we're going to discuss the IPCC's approach to resilience. According to Holling in 1973, resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb and utilize or even benefit from perturbations and changes that attain it, and so persist without a qualitative change in the system structure. In this context, vulnerability refers to instances where neither its robustness nor its resilience enables a system to survive without structural changes. Robustness refers to the structural and other properties of the system that allow it to deal with disturbances without adapting. Human beings have a number of characteristics that enable social systems to dispose of a much wider range of dynamics than do those of other species. They can communicate, they are capable of learning, and learning how to learn. They have therefore a range of very rapid dynamics at their disposal. Learning is context-specific. Therefore, adaptive capacity is based on societal values, perceptions, and levels of cognition. It's also related to the institutional patterns of collective action. The key point to know what makes a system vulnerable is the consideration of two properties of the system. An external disturbance usually triggers a number of reactions at different spatiotemporal scales. Which of these eventually overcomes the disturbance of the impacts of the episode will be on the dynamics of that system. Depends on the persistence of the disturbance and the history of that system. Secondly, faster dynamics can react to slowly dynamics, but not vice versa. Hence, in a competitive interaction between faster and slower dynamics, the survival of the former depends on their resilience and the persistence of the latter on their robustness. Here we're going to discuss the different states of impacts and vulnerability. Perry and Carter in 1998 defined impacts this way. Few formal definitions of impacts of climate change. The term vulnerability is more commonly used. The term impacts is used more loosely. Here's a table of impacts versus of vulnerability. And if you notice, they're very similar, but they do have some distinct differences. Where the impact assessment is how bad are the risks, the vulnerability assessment is what would reduce the risks. The impact assessment attempts to predict impacts, where the vulnerability assessment investigates the causes of vulnerability. The multiple stressors versus the impact assessment focuses on a single stress, where vulnerability looks at multiple stressors. And the vulnerability assessment treatment of adaptation is central to it, and impact assessment of treatment of adaptation is an afterthought. The time frame being examined is also a very important matter. Those interested in understanding impacts of climate change ought to look over many decades, perhaps out to the year 2100. This is because climate change impacts become more easy to detect or differentiate from current climate variations in the long run. Those more interested in current vulnerability or adaptation strategies may wish to focus on the next few decades, maybe up to about 2050. This is generally because most policymakers would have difficulty planning for more than a few decades, and some might even have difficulty planning for a few decades into the future due to all of the uncertainties. And here we have the vulnerability and adaptation assessment, the different approaches for the two systems. When starting a vulnerability assessment, you've got to start asking yourself questions when you start scoping out the project. What is of concern? Concerns may not be expressed in climate terms, storm intensity and frequency, but in consequences of climate impacts on people, infrastructure, and ecosystems. You got to ask yourself who and what may be affected. Another question is, how far into the future are we concerned? Or is this concern really just about the current risks, which could be made worse through climate change? Some more questions to ask is, for what purpose is the assessment to be conducted? Are you trying to engage more stakeholders? Are you enhancing the scientific understanding of the system? Are you designing adaptation strategy or formulating adaptation projects? Who is the target end user of the results of your vulnerability and adaptation assessment? What level of technical details do you have to provide? What treatment of uncertainties do you need to consider? And what format should you focus on for presenting the results? Some additional questions is, what kind of output information is expected? Are these just for public awareness materials? Are you trying to look at key vulnerabilities so that you can help incorporated into a larger system map? What a national or sectoral adaptation strategy, or a combination of all of them? And what resources are available? What funding is available? What personnel and expertise? And what data do you have in hand? And lastly, or another question to ask is, how much time is available? So this is a quick overview of our development of our assessment tool here at ERDC and with the PDT. We're currently in phase 1, where we're determining the most important habitat types for coastal areas. We're identifying the critical drivers and stressors for each of those habitat types, and we're constructing a conceptual framework for incorporating all of those habitats into our vulnerability assessment. The next phase, 2 and 3, which will be completed next year, is applying a mathematical relationship to each habitat type to link it to vulnerability to environmental disturbances. We want to test the assessment tool with the district personnel, and then lastly, we'll develop guidance on how to apply the assessment tool at the district level. So now's when you need to get out your pen and paper, because these are the habitat types, and you'll notice at the top of each one of these slides it says draft, because this is a work in progress, and if you have a habitat type that needs our attention, please do bring that to my attention. This list is adapted from the Coastal Marine Ecological Classification Standards. We have our beach and dunes, where they're gently sloping zone formed by unconsolidated material at the shoreline. We have our marshes, which are dominated by emergent helophytic herbaceous vegetation along low wave energy intertidal zone areas of estuaries and rivers. We have our shrub wetland, dominated by woody vegetations generally less than 6 meters, 20 feet tall. Shrub wetlands include the shrub-dominated portions of high salt marshes, as well as stunted or low mangrove communities. We also have the mangrove forest, tidally influenced, dense tropical or subtropical forest with the shores zone dominated by true mangroves that generally are 6 meters or taller. The mollusk or oyster reef, an area of accumulated shell reef surrounded and intermixed with channels in an unvegetated flat. Mollusk reefs are formed by the aggregation of mollusk shells into a fixed cohesive substrate. They generally occur in the intertidal zone, but sometimes can occur in the subtidal zone. Included in the mollusk reefs are mussels, oysters, or any other mollusk. Coral reefs, physical features generated by the production of fixed cohesive substrate through the incorporation of dissolved calcium carbonate into the reef structure. Coral reefs may occur in deep, cold water or shallow, warm waters. Sorry about that. We got our flats, our sand flats and mud flats. Surfaces are areas landmarked by little or no relief that are often composed of unconsolidated sediments. Included in flats are tidal flats composed of sand or mud in association with inlets, barrier islands, or shallow estuaries affected by wind-driven water level fluctuations. Then our islands, an area of land completely surrounded by water, an elevated area of land surrounded by swamp or marsh, which is isolated at high water or during floods. Critical type of island are the barrier islands, which we have several along the Gulf Coast of the U.S. Barrier islands commonly have dunes, vegetated zones, and swampy or marshy terrains extending lagoonward from the beach. The banks or scarps is the elevated area above the surrounding seafloor that rises near the surface, formed by geological processes. Banks tend to occur on the continental shelf and are generally low relief features, or modest to substantial extent, that normally remain submerged. Scarps are relatively straight, cliff-like face or slope of considerable linear extent, which breaks up the general continuity of the land by separating surfaces lying at different levels. And our aquatic vegetation beds, subtidal or intertidal bottoms of any areas characterized by dominant cover of rooted vascular plants, attached microalgae or mosses, which are usually submerged in the water column or floating on the surface. In some cases, aquatic vegetation beds may be exposed during low tides. So please take a good mental note of the habitat types that we are taking into consideration for this vulnerability assessment tool. And if you have any additions, please contact me, or if you'd like to help assist with determining what drivers or stressors you experience in your particular district so that we make sure to include those in the final product, please do contact me with any questions. Next, we're going to discuss the different types of frameworks. Vulnerability and adaptation assessment frameworks can be categorized along different orientations. Most commonly, they are grouped into two categories, top-down or bottom-up. Top-down methods describe climate scenario-driven and downscaled approaches that progress through the physical sciences to socioeconomic outcomes, which are largely exploratory, whereas bottom-up approaches start from the socioeconomic outcomes at the local scale to manage vulnerability through adaptation, and are largely normative. This is an example of a top-down framework. So it's focusing on the long-term, year 2100 or beyond, with implications of climate change, and they're often scenario-driven. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 7-step process. They define the problem, they select the method, test the method, select scenarios, assess biophysical and socioeconomic impacts, assess autonomous adjustments, and evaluate adaptation strategies at the end. I wanted to reintroduce some of the purpose and the objectives, and just remind everyone that one of the main objectives of this work unit is so that we can clearly communicate the vulnerability of a system based on a core accepted protocol and framework. Next, we'll discuss the bottom-up frameworks. Adaptation frameworks tend to address more near-term concerns such as vulnerability to climate variability. Socioeconomic context is very important. They also tend to invoke stakeholders more than the impacts frameworks. The United Nations Development Program Adaptation Policy Framework, APF, is the first of the second-generation frameworks. It was developed to place much more emphasis on current vulnerabilities to climate variability than were the first-generation frameworks. Thus, assessing current vulnerability is the second step in the framework. The framework also emphasizes continued stakeholder involvement in the assessment process. The picture up above on this slide is the United Kingdom Climate Impacts Program. It's one of the most comprehensive and ambitious national programs to address climate change impacts and adaptations. They have organized information on climate change and vulnerabilities in Britain and have worked closely with stakeholders in many regions to address adaptation and climate change. They've published a guidance on how to address adaptation. The main steps in the guidance are displayed above in the slide. This framework is to enhance decision-making under uncertainties associated with climate change. It encourages decision makers to consider all relevant uncertainties within the decision context, including climate change uncertainties, as well as uncertainties related to its adaptive capacity and performances of policies under future conditions. One thing to notice on this 8-step framework is all of the feedback loops so that you ensure that you don't move on to the next step before all questions have been answered about the assessment during the assessment framework. There are also a couple of other alternative approaches. You have the risk hazard framework, common to risk applications. Chain sequence begins with hazard concept of vulnerability commonly implicit as noted on the dotted lines. You have the pressure and release framework, common to risk research, with emphasis placed on social conditions of exposure. Concept of vulnerability usually is explicit. Some of the components of vulnerability are identified and linked to factors beyond the system of study and operating at various scales. One thing to notice on this flow chart is the framework is the how they've color coded the different regions. You have the place, the particular site in blue, the larger region in yellow, and how it implies on world changes in green. And so this is one of the ways that you can make sure to include the bigger picture when doing a vulnerability assessment. Some of the details of the exposure, sensitivity, and resilience components of the vulnerability framework. In this particular flow chart, you have the exposure, sensitivity, and the resilience. And notice how the exposure leads to determining what the sensitivity is, the human conditions or environmental conditions, and that feed into your resilience trying to help develop a sustainable system. Some elements for inclusion in any vulnerability analysis are multiple interacting perturbations and stresses and the sequencing of them. Exposure beyond the presence of perturbation and stress or stress, including the manner in which the coupled system experiences hazards. Sensitivity of the coupled system to the exposure. The system's capacity to cope or respond, including the consequences and attendant risks of slow recovery. The system's restructuring after the response is taken, and nested scales and scalar dynamics of the hazards, coupled systems, and their responses. When developing and selecting the framework to assess the system, no particular framework can be recommended without a specific context. Different frameworks are appropriate for different needs and have different requirements. What's the need in the long run what is needed in the long run is a combination of top-down and bottom-up approaches and their elements. You should not begin with the methods or models you have in hand, but with the questions we've discussed today. The frameworks are divided between adaptation and impacts. What's desirable is if these approaches can be merged in a manner that can begin with vulnerabilities, but can integrate long-term risks and climate change. Once you've determined the questions to be addressed, and the availability of the resources, only then can you look at what methods and models are appropriate for your system. And that is the extent of the presentation. We are soliciting as much support or information as we can to incorporate into our framework development so that we can incorporate that into the tool that will be the outcome of this effort. Any questions or comments?
Bobby, I've gotten one here. There was a question of including any freshwater coastal habitats. Have y'all considered that?
Yes, we have, and we've discussed that. And the tricky thing is once you start including the freshwater habitats, how far up do how far down the rabbit hole do you climb with that one? But with regards to specific freshwater habitats, we can look into including that in the framework as well. But one of the main focuses is the coastal, and so we've drawn that line as kind of brackish water out. But if it's affected by the coastal processes as well, we can look into helping to include that in the framework. So I would love to follow up with that.
Okay, that was from Molly Reef here in Urdick.
Okay.
We received another question from Angie Sowers. She wanted to know, she was mentioning that in the Chesapeake Bay they have high marsh and low marsh. Does the marsh habitat category account for these differences? Are y'all including the differentiation there? And then if not, then it might be suitable to do so. That'd be a consideration she suggested.
That's an excellent point to make. Thank you, Angie. We will definitely make sure to. There's multiple subcategories in the marsh classification, and so we can make sure to include definitely high and low marsh if that wasn't already on our radar. But that's a great suggestion.
Very good. Here's another question from the San Francisco district. Brian was curious about using coastal vulnerability indexes in regions that share the same government and policymakers but contain different coastal zones. And his example was San Mateo County in California, which contains the Pacific Ocean and San Francisco Bay in the same jurisdiction.
So that's actually been a topic of discussion with our PDT, and we need to continue that discussion. And I'd love to maybe see if the San Francisco district has any insight on the best way to handle this particular problem. But one of the big things with doing any assessment, whether it's a vulnerability assessment or habitat resiliency or whatever, is the scaling. And so where do you draw your boundaries? And so that's one of the big things that we're grappling with, is being sure that we're giving the right guidance on how to best characterize a zone or a habitat. And so one of the things that we've started to focus on is doing habitat vulnerability assessments. And so if you have a larger zone with multiple habitat types in it, that's how we are looking at handling that problem moving forward, is by looking at habitat by habitat. But that's a great question on how to, it's comparing apples to apples, but, the problem is it's Gala apples to Fuji apples in a lot of these instances. And so we're grappling with that. So I'd love to have some further discussion with the San Francisco district if you guys would send me an email or drop me a line.
Very good. Thank you. If anybody else wants to comment there, feel free. You can unmute your line with *6 or chat in. Bobby, have y'all done any workshop type engagements with districts, or has this been mostly research at the lab thus far with other PIs?
It's been research focused, and we've reached out to a couple of districts to work with them on case studies. Thank you for bringing that up, Courtney. So we currently have discussed with some of the Great Lakes districts and some personnel in Mobile and Norfolk about working on a couple of case studies where we can apply this framework and methodology, and also just working on getting information out that's been accomplished at the different districts, so that we can help to ensure that the entire Corps is aware of the work that's being done on this topic. And so if you have a potential case study that you'd like to discuss with me, or if you have some ideas that you'd like to bounce around and see if we can collaborate on a short case study or anything like that, please also contact me, because I think it's sad, unfortunately, how little how easily it is to get stuck in our own zone sometimes and not be aware of all the other great things that are going on in the Corps of Engineers.
So some of your effort here is, I guess you could say, cataloging, or just making those things commonly available across districts. And
as best we can, yeah.
Very good. Here's another question. The coastal zone to be considered probably needs to be based on a 50-year, 100-year, and longer sea level rise forecast, not just on current brackish and seawater marine habitats. That's a consideration.
That's a good point.
Because I guess, yes, that would change with those predictions over those long time ranges. Okay. Here's another question from Jacksonville. How will this study engage and include other agencies such as NOAA, Department of Interior, EPA, Department of Transportation, and others? Have y'all considered reaching out?
Yes, and I've reached out to, I've got a contact with NOAA, and we have we would love to collaborate as much as we can, and a lot of great work's been done by the other industries or the other agencies on this topic. And so one of the things that I want to make sure is that we're not reinventing the wheel so that we can extend the state of the science versus just, we want to make sure that we incorporate other agencies in the discussion. And I've been in discussion with USGS fairly recently, but I would like to engage as many as possible.
Excellent. Right now, do you anticipate that being more on a one-on-one level, or will there be at some point, do you envision kind of a workshop or symposium or something around the topic maybe to do that? Have y'all discussed that yet?
We have not discussed that, but I would not rule that out for sure.
I know we have some agency partners on the call with us today as well, so I'm sure they might have some input for you after the meeting as well.
Yes, please do reach out to me with any and all questions. I would love to engage as many people as possible in these determining steps so that we can make sure that we help to build a tool that is most useful to a broader audience.
Very good. All right. Are there any other questions for Bobby or suggestions or perhaps comments about what's been done thus far?
This is Matt Schrader from Jacksonville. I had a quick question.
Yes. Yeah. Go right ahead.
Yeah, Bobby, with the NAAQS, the North Atlantic Coastal Comprehensive Study, they had a environmental and cultural exposure index in what they did. How different is what you guys are doing from what they used?
So one of the things that we are looking to accomplish with this tool is to take in the three components of vulnerability: the geomorphic, the physical, and the socioeconomic, and so that we can have all of the drivers and factors affecting the coastal system built into one tool and have that suited for the coastlines of the Corps of Engineers. Does that answer the question or not?
I guess I was just a little bit more interested in maybe the stressors, and maybe you guys haven't figured that out yet. They mainly looked at inundation, kind of water levels, and so it seems like you guys are getting a little bit more focused on different types of stressors maybe.
Yeah, so trying to include the array of stressors, whatever might be the stressors in that system. And some of the stressors, without a true sensitivity analysis, it's really hard to determine what are the main drivers, but a lot of the vulnerability indices out there do just look at what the main driver is, or the most important stressor on that system, versus taking in the cumulative effects of all the stressors. And so we'd like to be able to include all of the stressors that are of importance in that in a particular system.
Okay, and you guys are still developing that, I understand. And I'm asking because, in the South Atlantic, we're starting the South Atlantic Coast Study. So I'd like to, get on the phone with you and discuss some of that and just see, basically because we're using the framework that NAAQS developed. So just get on the line with you and talk about some changes or some things we want to stick with, et cetera, with what you guys are doing.
Well, and that'd be a great opportunity. I'd love to talk more in detail later. Is what problems do y'all have with the current systems, and how can we avoid those or make it a more user-friendly type system moving forward?
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian.
All right. Any other questions for Bobby? I received an inquiry about the webinar files, both the presentation as well as the recording, and so I posted the link to where we archive these webinars. And you could follow that and see what we've done in the past, as well as watch for the webinar files to be posted following the meeting. Right now we've got the Bobby's webinar up there, but we'll post the PowerPoint and recording following the meeting.
So, sounds like there's a lot of people excited about this topic. So please do reach out to me or any member of the PDT on that first slide. We would love to discuss this in further detail, and please just let us know if you have any suggestions or would have any opportunities to collaborate. We welcome any input, positive or negative.
Very good. Thank you for that, Bobby. Thanks for getting us up to speed on what y'all have done thus far and your plan going forward. Okay, well, thank you very much, Bobby, for sharing your work today. Other than just the continuation of these conversations or additional questions, any other comments before we go? Thank you all very much for tuning in. We do have another restoration webinar scheduled for next Tuesday, the 4th of September, on the development of a Minnesota River environmental flow modeling framework. And that's once again going to be shared by Dr. Kyle McKay. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that one as well. And I'll send an Outlook invitation similar to this last meeting. So please watch that for future announcements. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. That will conclude our meeting.